you do not want to see the captions, you can click on the down-facing arrow next to the word Media Viewer the same way you might if you want to hide the chat box. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, you can return to the email that you received with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. Sometimes sound cuts out due to internet connection, so feel free to call in if that's a problem for you. If you're experiencing technical difficulties and are unable to contact Angelica Medina, you may also call WebEx Tech Support to resolve any issues. That phone number, which we will also post in the chat box, is 1-866-229-3239. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Rachel.
Okay, great. And thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to get started here. And thanks for typing in the place where you're from as well. I like to see the chat box. We're going to use the chat box a little bit, especially in the second part of the presentation. So the trick that I like to do actually is to, you see those little tiny triangles next to where it says participants, next to where it says chat, and next to where it says media viewer. You can make the participants one small, and you can make the media viewer small. And then if you do that, then the chat one will take up kind of your whole right-hand panel there. So that may be helpful to kind of, fiddle with now, so you can see that, because we're going to use, this is going to be a participatory webinar, especially in the second half of it, so I'd love for you all to be able to see what other folks are saying. So great, so I'm going to get started with our first slide here. I really appreciate you all being on today, taking some time out of your Thursday afternoon or your lunch break to join us today. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy Project. And I realize that some folks on the call may have heard some of the past Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy or TILA webinars, either online, they are available online, or in person if you see me come out and do a training in person. And I'm going to be doing covering a little bit today, kind of what we would go over in a basic, TILA training. But a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is more of the next phase of the TILA project, and so sort of what we're trying to move into. So I'm going to introduce a little bit our organization, and then I'm going to get into more how we're going to go over all that today. So, so the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health is one of a handful of federally funded resource centers, and all of us that together compose the Domestic Violence Resource Network, or DVRN, all of us are funded to support the work of the domestic violence field, and we're all funded on different topics. We're one of what will soon be approximately 8 resource centers on domestic violence. All of us are funded through the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, which is the same program that funds direct services, so domestic violence programs, domestic violence shelters, as well as domestic violence coalitions are also funded through the FIPSA office, the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program. And that matters because the work that we're doing is really, as a resource center, is really to support the work that direct service providers are doing on the ground. And so it's really important to us to have that dialogue back and forth with folks that are doing the work in the field. And that's really part of what I wanted to talk about today, is being able to really do that well. Yeah, so it sounds like some folks are having trouble with audio, and there are some instructions on that in the chat. I hope you can join us soon. Right, so NCDVTMH. And so the work of NCDVTMH over the years has been both to think about, with our expertise being around the intersection of domestic violence, trauma, mental health, as well as substance use. We've really been thinking about how the mental health field, as well as the substance use treatment field, can do a better job of responding to the needs of domestic violence survivors and their children. And in addition to that, we think about the domestic violence field and the ways the domestic violence field can build their capacity with relation to trauma-informed services, as well as to specifically serving survivors of domestic violence who do experience needs related to mental health, trauma, substance use, or addiction. And so that's historically been the work of NCDVTMH in both the mental health and domestic violence field. And I've been working here at the center for, at this point, over 5 years. And a couple of years ago, I started to get some questions specifically from legal advocates as well as from attorneys who represent domestic violence survivors in court. I was getting questions about how the perspective of the center, NCDVTMH, with regard to trauma-informed work with domestic violence survivors, how does that apply really to the work of legal advocates and attorneys, which is really different in a number of ways. And so if you're working as a legal advocate or attorney, you're often doing work just physically. You might be meeting with someone at the courthouse. I do a lot of pro bono work out of the jails and the prisons here in Chicago and in Illinois. And so a lot of times just at the physical level, what we have control over is very different, as well as obviously the procedures and the policies and the rules. And we're usually doing a job in these roles of helping survivors to navigate these legal systems that are really complex and that we don't have a lot of control over, and that, as we all know, can often be re-traumatizing. And so what it means to do trauma-informed work well as legal advocates and as attorneys is different than it is for someone that perhaps is working within their own program and may be able to make changes within that program and are not maybe supporting someone as they're working through a system that we don't have control over. So some of the issues that come up around that, those were the questions that directly inspired the creation of the Trauma-Informed Legal Advocacy Project a few years ago. And I started with just a couple of scenarios, did just a small training here in Chicago. All of the TILA work is scenario-based, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I was trying to sort of build something that would bridge the philosophy with the real everyday issues that come up specifically for legal advocates and for attorneys, so that we could have a combination of the philosophical understanding, what it means to have a trauma-informed approach, what it means to have an accessibility approach and a domestic violence advocacy lens at the same time, but also what does that actually mean for our day-to-day work, and how can we think about that in a really concrete, practical, everyday sense of the word. So that's what inspired the TILA project to start to grow. And we've had a lot of interest in it over the years, and including from attorneys who at their local agency run pro bono programs, who train new attorneys or new staff attorneys as well as pro bono attorneys on domestic violence, and have been wanting to incorporate some of the TILA work into their presentations. And so I started to wonder if there's a way that we could really start to move the TILA project into a next phase. I really believe that the best work in this field in general is done together. We tackle huge issues, and I believe that the work that we're doing here should really be a dialogue with the work that other agencies are doing, whether you're also working at a resource center or whether you're working and providing direct services to domestic violence and sexual assault survivors and their children. So that was my hope and thought behind sort of thinking about how could TILA move into the next phase. So let's see here. So what I'm going to do today, just trying to get my slides. There we go. Okay. So you'll see the next slide there, the table of contents. So we're just going to have a 1-hour webinar today. So it's going to be a short webinar. And like I said, the latter part of it was really going to be questions and feedback. But before that, I want to start off just by providing a little bit of information about the TILA project framework. So that's going to be similar to how I would open a TILA training if I were doing it, for an audience, doing like a regular, TILA introduction. Provide a little bit about the framework, the philosophical framework that the TILA project is based on. But I also want to talk a little bit about the thinking behind the model, the scenario-based model that I've used for the TILA project. And I'm actually going to go in and take one of the scenarios, taking a very abridged version of one of the scenarios, and kind of break it down and show you slide by slide, piece by piece, some of what I was thinking behind why I put things together the way that I put them together. So it's a little bit of a training of trainers. I want to give you some of the thinking behind why the TILA project is set up the way that it is. And then we'll move on and talk a little bit about this concept of some kind of a TILA network that we'll be hoping to launch later on this fall, and we'll do questions and feedback. So that's my plan for today. So you'll get a little, if you've never been on a TILA training, like I said, you'll get a flavor of that today. You'll get a little bit of direct training in terms of the philosophy behind it, the thinking behind it. But if you're really interested, it's your first TILA webinar or training of any kind, I do recommend that at some point you go on our website. All of our webinars from NCDVTMH are free and available to watch on our website, and you can watch. There's an introduction to TILA that you can watch, and includes 3 scenarios. So that's where we'll start. So part 1, we're just going to talk a little bit about the framework and the teaching model behind TILA. So when I open a TILA training, I start just by thinking about the folks that we work with, both ourselves and the folks that we work with, and thinking about how we all come to this setting in which you're meeting with someone with diverse perspectives, a large diversity of life experiences. And that can include, obviously, experiences of trauma. So the folks that we're working with, the folks we work with, many of them have experiences of past trauma as well as survival. And what I'd like to offer to you is that as legal advocates and attorneys, it's part of our job to know how to work in partnership and really in allyship with people who have experienced a lot of violence. And when I say that, what I mean by that is not just that we learn trauma information so that our jobs for lawyers, for example, can be easier, so that we know how to capture or pull information out of somebody. That's not what I mean by that. And I also don't mean that we're just, I think folks have the idea that, trauma-informed work is really just about learning how to treat people gently and how to handle people with kid gloves, which I would say is sort of an offensive way to think about that. And I would offer to you that it's really a lot more than that, that as legal advocates and attorneys, what we need to learn how to do is to really try to integrate an understanding that people can be impacted in a number of ways by trauma, and also that they may have used a number of strategies to survive. And we need to learn how to hold these responses with equal compassion and respect. But because we're working as legal advocates and attorneys, and because we're helping folks to navigate these complex systems, in addition to that, we need to be thinking about how we're doing that. We're helping survivors to navigate these systems, and the systems themselves may be doing the opposite of that. So the systems themselves may be re-traumatizing and sometimes downright harmful to the folks that we're working with. And that we want to always be thinking that we're basing our work and we're basing our perspective from a deep respect for the experiences that people have, and also that we don't have our compassion or our allyship with survivors to depend. We don't want it to depend on this sort of unrealistic expectation that folks have a perfect response to situations such as domestic violence or poverty that, by their nature, if not by their design, deny people a safe and dignified response, or deny people options for safe and dignified response. So these are the impacts of systematic problems like domestic violence and poverty, is that by their nature they deny people options to survive that are safe and dignified, and really the options that people would choose for themselves if those possibilities weren't taken away. And so as legal advocates and attorneys working through these systems that don't share those beliefs about having respect for folks around survival strategies, and also deeply understanding the impacts of trauma, that we have to be especially good at holding on to those philosophies, and we also have to be especially good at being able to put those philosophies into practice in a really pragmatic way. And we're doing that often under less than ideal conditions. Just as an example, just this morning, I do pro bono work with domestic violence survivors, and most of my work with DV survivors has been with survivors who are incarcerated. And just this morning, I was at Cook County Jail, which is the jail here in Chicago. And if you don't know, I believe it's the largest jail, if I'm not mistaken, in the which is, say, jail as in pretrial facility in the country. And I was meeting with a domestic violence survivor she's currently incarcerated pretrial, so she's back behind, we went to court, and she's, held back behind the judge's desk in the custody of the sheriffs. And they call that part of the courtroom, they call it the bullpens, that area where there's cages for people to be held waiting pretrial. And a lot of people will tell you that you can't do trauma-informed work in that environment. You can't do it. So I'm going back to talk with a survivor, with my mentor and co-counsel, and I'm meeting with her literally with bars between us, and she's preparing to step up for this. It's just a brief status hearing. And people will tell you cannot do trauma-informed work in that context. And I would say that that's wrong. I would say that our work as attorneys and legal advocates is to really think about how we can not just be trauma-informed in our own interactions with that person, even if the situation that they're in is clearly re-traumatizing. But in addition to that, our work is to support that survivor's resiliency as she moves through the process of the system. And in a lot of ways, that's a harder job, and it's also a more important job because we have to really be attuned not just to our own interactions, but to the impact of the environment around her. So if that makes sense. So this is just to get, the point I wanted to make on this slide was just to offer to you that all of that is really part of our work. And I just wanted to capture a little bit what it means to me to think about doing trauma-informed legal advocacy. So again, thinking about it's not just learning how to use trauma information to make our jobs easier. It's not just learning how to treat people gently. It's really a deeper sense of learning how to support survivors' resiliency as they move through these different systems. Okay. And in addition to that, if as I start these trainings, I talk a little bit about, in addition to that, here at the center, the way that we talk about trauma-informed work is that at its heart, it's relational, and we're both a part of that equation. So we have the folks that we're working with, and in the situations that we're talking about as service providers, we're in the situation of supporting that person or providing that person representation. Or some kind of service. And so we also have to think about how our own experiences of trauma and survival may impact how we approach the work, and they can obviously impact them in a number of different ways, including providing us with a sense of inspiration, deep understanding and love for other humans and an appreciation of their resiliency. It can also bring anger, often righteous and helpful anger. Sometimes on some days, maybe not necessarily anger that you're finding helpful on that particular day. Certainly a source of knowledge and inspiration. But there's also risks around that in terms, especially for self-identifying at work as a survivor. It can also result in us being patronized or treated as though we're fragile or damaged, which is an offensive term, in some way, which are not true. And also, I think sometimes there's a risk that can be even romanticized as well. So these are all things that impact when we think about how we self-identify in the work, and also how we approach the work if we have our own experiences of past trauma and survival, and that those matter as well. Okay, so I use this little image, and I apologize if you've heard me say this joke before. I drew this little thing, and then I later on, I had this training in Anchorage, Alaska, which I'd never been to before, and they had this question for me, which was like, but is it like a glacier, or like, what? And I was, I obviously never thought about that before, so I was like, I don't know, it's an iceberg, I don't know what. So don't get too scientific with me on this particular picture, but I like to use a little bit of imagery to kind of explain a little bit what I'm thinking about here. So usually when I show this slide, I talk a little bit about, in our work we see people with a lot of different needs, a lot of different ways of communicating and engaging with the world, and ways of surviving. And we may not know always why we're seeing what we're seeing, and of course trauma can be one of the things that's beneath the surface. And so if we were to think about building or putting together a TILA framework, it would include both accessibility and a trauma-informed approach. But what's important and specific about our work, you know, there's a lot of really, I'm just going to bounce back for a second to make this point. There's a lot of really good work that's happening out there, trauma-informed work that thinks about folks' experiences of past trauma. But for those of us that work in domestic violence, and I would really argue for any of us, if we think more broadly about experiences of violence as well as coercion and oppression and poverty in our society, really all of us, I think, need to be thinking along these lines. But certainly if we're working with survivors of domestic violence, we need to think about how for individuals experiencing domestic violence, trauma is not only in the past, it's also ongoing. And so what that means in real life is that folks' responses can also be representing ways that they are actively keeping themselves safe. And so one of the classic examples that we use to make this point is that if you were to have someone who had returned from a combat zone in another country, and they're in a parking lot, for example, and they hear a loud noise, and they duck down or they dive down to the floor, you may wonder if that person is having a response to past trauma. But if that person is a survivor of domestic violence who just left her partner, it's also very possible that that person is doing something to actively avoid being injured in that moment, right? And so that's one of the examples that we use to make that point. Responses may also represent ways that people are actively keeping themselves safe. Another example that I use occasionally for this is to think about you know, folks that are living without a house. So living on the street, and you know, it may be that they have a lot of body odor, and that can be something that can be associated with a lot of different things. One thing that people often don't think about is body odor can be something that's helpful in terms of keeping someone safe if they're living in a situation like living on the streets where there's a lot of folks experience a lot of violence. That can be an additional strategy to keep people physically away from them, to keep some distance between themselves and other people. So there's a lot of different ways when we start to think about it, that the things that we're seeing, we can't make assumptions about them. They may come from a lot of different places. And the important thing, again, about that is that we're holding all of those possibilities with equal compassion and respect. Okay, so we're holding a trauma-informed view, but we're also holding an advocacy perspective. So this is going back to that silly iceberg drawing. We can see how we're both thinking about trauma as well as thinking about ongoing violence, coercion, oppression, and in addition to that, the ways that folks have survived the experiences that they have, and how all of those experiences of trauma as well as ongoing violence, having to live and adapt to oppression and poverty in our world, affect the ways that people figure out how to survive. And so that represents strength and resiliency, and we need to be holding all of those things at the same time. So we're building our trauma-informed framework. We're building our trauma-informed legal advocacy framework, and these are some of the components of what that would include. And so, right, and so we talked a little bit earlier about this framework that the Center NCDVTMH holds, but the project of the TILA project work is really to start thinking about how that applies in a really concrete level to doing legal advocacy. Because I think I talked a little bit about this earlier, maybe I got excited and talked about some of my later slides a little bit too early, but the point I was making earlier around this was, as legal advocates and attorneys, we're constantly helping survivors to navigate systems that we don't have full control over, and so they're often re-traumatizing as well as sometimes actively hurtful to survivors, particularly survivors who obviously are involved in criminal cases, as well as survivors who are involved in custody cases and facing potentially loss of their children. Okay, and so in this role, our goals as legal advocates and attorneys include certainly to try to build true partnerships with survivors, to ourselves have trauma-informed interactions, but also, and this was a point that I was making with regard to the client I was meeting this morning, I'm thinking about my own trauma-informed interaction with her, but I'm also thinking about ways to support her in navigating through risks and harms that we can't control. So that's what's special about this work. It's not to diagnose survivors. This is not, the TILA project is not a project of going through and learning all these things that people refer to as diagnoses and trying to figure out how to apply that to survivors. That's not our role. And our role is also not to take on the role of a therapist. We obviously do some emotional support in the course of our work, but we can do really good trauma-informed work without taking on the role of a therapist. There's really smart people out there that do therapy, and we're over here and we're doing legal work. And the point is that our work should fit holistically together, that our work should fit well together, not that we need to go off and take on other roles, but that we need to be thinking about our work as connected to the work of the other folks in someone's life, whether they're formal therapists or whether they're friends and family that are supporting that person's emotional safety as well. I'd like one more point about this, which is that another way that I think about this sometimes, we're working in all of these, when we do legal advocacy, we're working within all of these different constraints. So some of them might be around time, for example. Sometimes, you will hear, a trauma-informed strategy in general is to give someone the time that they might need, particularly around disclosure of past trauma, details related to a past violent attack, for example. Give someone time, let them have choice over whether they disclose. And attorneys and legal advocates say, well, but if I really were to subscribe to that in practice, this person is not going to get, for example, an order of protection today. So we're talking about really, when I apply that to my life, how do I work that out, and what does that mean? And so trying to answer, instead of walking away from those questions, really trying to provide the best answer that we can. That's the project that we're working on. And one of the ways I think about this is that what we're doing is we might be really good as particularly as folks, for example, working in order of protections, of thinking about someone's physical safety. But another way of thinking about this is that we're also adding a concern for someone's emotional safety. And we're not throwing either of them out. We have to figure out ways to navigate both of those things. And we don't have to do it by ourselves. We can do it with the person that we're working with. Right? So that person is also constantly navigating and figuring out and balancing between different goals that need to be. You can't necessarily have all of both of them in this system as it currently exists. And so balancing between physical and emotional safety is another way to think about the work, I think, particularly of legal advocates and attorneys in terms of how you're thinking about applying a trauma-informed perspective to your work. Okay, and so that was the question. So this just sort of summarizes what we were talking about. The question is, what does it look like to apply an accessible, trauma-informed social justice approach to legal advocacy? So that's the question of the TILA project. So, no small task here. Those are our big ideas, and the goal here is to take those big ideas and apply them to real life. So let's take the real questions that people are asking us and try to come up with some ideas, some things to try. So I'm going to tell you what is usually included in a TILA, what's part of the approach, and then I'm going to show you that abridged example. So you can all of this is kind of going to come together where if you haven't seen it before, you'll see hands-on what a TILA scenario actually looks like. I know some of you have probably seen it already, so you're a little ahead of the game. So the TILA project approach to training, my thought was we're going to do it all scenario-based. So the whole training is built on scenarios, but they're very simple scenarios, and they're things that come up every single day. So all of the TILA scenarios, I think I have about a dozen that I actually regularly train on right now, are all based on questions that people really asked me. Legal aid attorneys who represent domestic violence survivors. In Chicago, we have a specialized domestic violence courthouse. I had the opportunity to do a little bit of work together with the domestic violence advocates who work directly out of the courthouse. Some of the questions are based on questions that they asked me or asked to the center, to the TILA project, and other questions that have come up over the years. So we take the scenario, take a basic, very simple, I'm talking one sentence fact pattern based on real questions that come up every day. So not like the most, not like the wildest thing that you can think of, but things that come up every day. And then what we're going to do is, for each scenario, I thought we're going to do this two-step analysis. First, we're going to try to provide some information about trauma, but also about domestic violence, because we've got that dual perspective, right? And second, we're going to provide some tips, some ideas, some suggestions, things to try if this is coming up in your work. And my thought with that is that, you know, we're not going to reach a point ever where we get through all the scenarios, no matter how many scenarios. If I gave you 100 scenarios today and we went through them, I guarantee you'll walk into the courthouse tomorrow and something else will come up, right? Because that's how life works, right? So the thought behind this was absolutely to give some practical strategies that you can use tomorrow. But in addition to that, to get folks into the habit of taking this philosophical underpinning and using this two-step approach to be creative in your day-to-day work. So you're constantly learning from ourselves, from our community, from the people that we're working with, more and more about good trauma-informed work, good domestic violence advocacy, and we're constantly trying new things to see what will work. So we want people to put that two-step analysis into practice, okay? And we're combining that final point there is about combining knowledge and philosophy with really concrete tips for practice. Okay, so for example, this is just an abridged version of one of my scenarios. Okay, so this scenario, which honestly could be built out and could be a number of scenarios, is about trauma, memory, and trust building. There's a lot packed in here. This is usually a pretty long scenario. This is one of the longer scenarios that I do. But as you can see, the scenario itself is very short. But by that I meant the number of slides to answer this scenario in total. But the scenario itself is about a sentence and a half here, right? So the scenario is someone doesn't share important information during the preparation of the petition for protective order, and it comes out later during a hearing. And this is obviously this is like an all day, every day. This happens to folks that are doing this work. And so you see here, like all of the TILA scenarios, this is based on a real question that, for this one in particular, hasn't come up just once, comes up literally all the time. And so then I show this slide, how do we react when this happens? And you have my note here, which is similar to the point that I just made. The goal of TILA is not to provide a formula for every possible scenario that could possibly come up, but rather to encourage all of us to make a shift in how we respond. And that starts with noticing how we usually respond. So usually when I do this slide, I say something, not that that's ever happened to you and everybody laughs, because it happens to all the time. And we get frustrated because we ourselves, as legal advocates or attorneys, put in all this work to be prepared for this hearing, and all the person that we were working with had to do was show up to court on time and be sober. And that's all we needed her to do, and it didn't happen. And so obviously we're going to be frustrated. And a lot of times we're frustrated with her, even though the reason we're really getting frustrated is that we know that the judge is not going to have a trauma-informed perspective, is not going to have patience around these things, is not going to have patience with regard to her car broke down the night before and she couldn't find a babysitter, et cetera. And so what we're really frustrated is with those broader issues, but our frustration often comes out on her. The other alternative is that sometimes we get frustrated with ourselves about that kind of stuff, which can also be detrimental, right, to the overall success of the work, both in that case and in terms of the longer marathon view of being able to keep ourselves from burning out in the work. Okay, so first we think about how we usually react when this happens, and we move to step one. We think about what is happening from the perspective of the person that you're working with. And I use this question, so I have this little thought bubble here. I added these to my slides, you guys. I know they're a little bit cheesy, but I think they're helping to get, maybe my point across here. So I have this concept that why would you use this question instead of what happened to her? So what happened to her obviously being, what happened to that person obviously being a basic part of trauma-informed work. We think about it's not what's wrong with her, it's what happened to her. You'll hear that a lot. I've shifted a little bit the language around that, and that really was inspired by Amy Judy, who's a disability rights attorney and advocate in Wisconsin. And she thinks a lot about accessibility. And so I started thinking about how to incorporate both an accessibility and trauma-informed lens into some of the things, some of the ways I was phrasing things in the TILA presentations. And so I shifted to think about what's happening from the perspective of the person we're working with. One thing I worry about a lot in the trauma work is that, and I think this is a misconception of how the trauma-informed work should be done, but I do observe that sometimes there's something that happens where, you know, folks say, oh, well, you know, for some people, they're not, and I'm putting big quotes around this, right? They're not really crazy. There's not something really wrong with them. It's just trauma. And that really troubles me. And the reason for that is because, you know, the move toward having a better understanding about the real impacts of trauma on all of our lives was not intended to be a way to distinguish between people who maybe identify their experiences as rooted in trauma in some ways and people who don't. That wasn't the goal of that work. But I see that happening sometimes, and it really troubles me from an accessibility point of view. So you'll see that one thing that I am learning how to and attempting to embed in these slides is really to hold both an accessibility and trauma-informed lens at the same time. So what's happening? What's the full experience of what could be happening from that person's perspective? And then, you know, so this is all part one, right? So I talk a little bit about, in this particular scenario, I talk a little bit about betrayal and trust. So for example, experiencing abuse, especially by someone who we should be able to trust, can make it hard to trust people in the future. So all of this in step one of every scenario, just providing some information about what could be happening from the perspective of the person in that scenario. So our first reaction is to sort of get into the shoes of that person and think, you know, there's a lot of things that could be going on for this person right now. In addition to that, in our scenario, it's relevant to think about trauma and memory. So during a traumatic incident, our survival response may cause us to take in information about some details and not about others. Or we might find it difficult to remember details later on or to access emotions that we felt at the time. So then I use this little chart that comes from the Cedron Institute that compares factors that influence continuous memory versus that increase the likelihood of dissociation. And so you see in that chart there in the background, you know, a single traumatic event, you're more likely to have continuous memory. Actually, if it's a natural or accidental cause, you're more likely to have continuous memory. If it's an adult victim, and if you receive validation and support following the traumatic incident, which is really fascinating, I think, for our work. And then on that right-hand side, factors that make it more likely that a person won't have full access to their memory of something. If it's a multi-event, if there's a deliberate human cause, if the person was a child at the time, and interestingly, if denial and secrecy is the response from the family or community around that person to that event happening, that's actually makes it more likely for a person to experience not having full memory of that event. And so anyway, so that's a slide that I do a little more, I talk a little bit more about when I do the training. But the point I want to make for you all is that you notice here that in this step one, we're including information both about domestic violence, so we talked about betrayal of trust, as well as about trauma. So in this case, we're talking about trauma and memory. And when I do the training, this is a little bit more built out, but I'm obviously working a little bit at a meta level right now. Okay, so then I move into step two, and this is where I really try to get, we've done the philosophical underpinning, we've given a little bit of information that's relevant to that specific scenario, and then we're going to move into some real concrete tips and things to try. So for example, in this particular scenario, I talk about transparency. So you can be transparent about why you're asking for information. So this gets to that betrayal issue and people trying to figure out what role you're really playing, and you know, maybe they just met you or they don't totally trust you yet for reasons that totally make sense. So I'm just modeling language here. The reason I'm asking is so that we can be prepared for every possible thing that your ex might say, not because I don't believe you. Right. So, and transparency is one of the, if you look up like some of the like lists of like, the trauma-informed principles, transparency is always on there. I think that's true. More and more, the more I work on this, the more I think that meaning making is really a big part of a lot of, is another, in addition to transparency, it's another thing that we're doing here. So we're giving that person some meaning, some reason behind the thing that's happening or the thing that we're doing or the thing that we're asking, and I do think that a lot of times that's a big part of what carries the weight. If you're helping that person to make meaning out of what's happening. So to give you an example, so you can see what I mean by that. So, for example, when I start working with someone, if it's not like a brief legal services case, if it's a case I'm working with representing that person over some course of time, I'll say there may be times where you call me and I don't call you back right away, and I just want you to know that that's never going to be because I just quit on you, or I decided I didn't like you, or I decided I didn't believe you. And remember, I work with a lot of survivors who are incarcerated, right? So this is also a huge thing in general for folks who are incarcerated. If I don't write you, if I don't call you back, if I don't write you back right away, I just, it might feel like that if that happens, if that feels like that to you. But I just want you to know that if that ever happens, it would only be because I'm busy working on other matters or with other clients, and I'm not able to get back to you. But I will always try to get back to you right away. But I want you to know that if it takes a couple of days for that to happen, I don't want you to worry. I don't want you to think that what that means is that I've decided that I don't believe you or something like that. So that's an example of meaning making sort of preemptively in that particular case, okay? You can be transparent about external risks and realities. In my experience, it's sometimes true that court is hard on people who, for example, were using substances at the time that they were assaulted. A lot of times courts believe that if you're doing that, it's your fault. But I just want you to know that I don't believe that. So this is another way to be transparent. This is also about identifying sort of where your allyship lies. Okay, and then just a reminder that there's no right answers here. So these are all ideas, they're tips, they're strategies, there's things to try, right? There's strategies and tools. There's certainly not a magic wand or a right answer, and there's no one-size-fits-all things either. These are just things that all of us have learned over the years. Okay. So that was to give you a sense both of what the TILA scenarios look like, my thinking behind putting them together the way that I have. So you can see the building blocks there, the links between the underlying philosophy that's embedded throughout, right? The step one that provides some information, and then the practical tips section. And all of these are sort of constantly being built out. And I wanted to say also that a lot of these, not all of the scenarios, but some of them are available in narrative format, so not necessarily in slide format, on our website. So I've got a lot of these posted. I do trainings on more scenarios that are posted here, but there's a lot of items that are available online that we've really built out over the last couple of years. But I've started to think about what's next, and what I would like to do is build both the conceptual and programmatic, by which I mean really the support, but also the logistical scaffolding for the TILA project to become more of a collective effort. So this is really this is my goal. This is my hope as what will be the next step with this project. And it's true that resources are limited for all of us. Certainly, this is not so. Just the TILA is not. It's funded as part of our broader work to meet the needs of the domestic violence field for resources. Support, training. Most of my work is actually policy work with relation to these issues. It's not an independently funded project. If anybody knows, somebody who wants to independently fund a project like this, send them my way. But currently, our resources are limited, and I'm sure that's true of all of you too. I think, I've gotten a lot of interest in TILA over the years, mostly from folks that are really doing the work and that are looking to incorporate these things. And I know that for all of us, all of our time is very precious and very limited, and we're all trying to use it the best way we can to make the most possible difference we can for domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors, and their children. But I do think that many possibilities exist for making this more of a collective effort that would be helpful to everyone. So here's some of the ideas that I had, and then for the last, I'm going to talk about this for just a couple minutes, and then I think we'll have a good couple minutes to talk together and have some feedback on this. So my thought for what a TILA network might include might be, first of all, just some simple way to connect attorneys and legal advocates so that we can share questions, ideas, skills, resources. And I'm super sort of lo-fi, low-key kind of girl. So I'm thinking like maybe that's a listserv, maybe everybody's on too many listservs they can't handle anymore. Maybe that's a quarterly call or quarterly webinar of some kind. But I want to do something that's not just me doing a webinar providing things, but so that people can actually share some of the, I know that folks are using strategies around this, whether you're calling it trauma-informed work or not, you're using strategies like this, you've developed ways to work around this, these kind of issues in your work with survivors. And so I want the center to be able to provide the logistical support for those skills and ideas, and resources and questions to be shared. So that's one thought that I had. And then a second thought was, I would love for, and I've had some interest in this, people have a bunch more questions, a bunch more possible scenarios that are really exciting with regard to, for example, things that are specific to working with sexual assault survivors, survivors of elder abuse, working specifically in immigration and asylum context. I'm sure that all of you have other ideas. And so my thought was, wouldn't it be great if there was a way for folks who are just interested to work together to develop these scenarios. And some of the scenarios are really short. Some of them are just a couple slides. And then to share those scenarios, whether they're in narrative format or PowerPoint, with each other, particularly for legal advocates and attorneys that are wanting to share that with their colleagues, either formally through trainings or informally, just in the office. So there's a way that folks can share the scenarios that are most relevant to them. So whether that's co-producing something with the center or referencing to us, but kind of doing your own thing and sharing that back with the group. So I'm playing around with that kind of idea. And then also I've gotten a lot of requests over the years from attorneys, particularly attorneys that are doing training for pro bono, attorneys in their area, to be able to integrate some of the TILA slides into a broader training on, domestic violence 101, how to represent a survivor in a custody or order protection case. Maybe you do that once a year, twice a year in your small, your local agency for your small community. You obviously can't bring in, don't have budget to bring in outside trainer, but you want to include some of this TILA work, and I really want to support that and figure out a way to increase access to TILA materials for those folks that are doing that kind of local interagency training kind of work. So those are some of my thoughts and ideas, and this is my slide about sushi. I did a sushi making birthday party. If anybody's trying to figure out like a good birthday party, idea, this was a really cool one, and that was the sushi that I made on the right-hand side, and I was happy with that. So the theory is, let's see what we have and see what we can make together. Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left. We're going to do the questions. This is the questions and feedback portion of the webinar. So just as a all I did was I prompted you to look at these ideas that I just threw out, but I'd be really interested if you guys have other ideas as well. So you can post questions directly into that chat box. So just as a reminder, that chat box is on the right-hand panel. And what I would really recommend is where you see participants 35. What you can do is if you click that triangle so that it's pointing to the right, that whole area will get small, and then your chat box will have plenty of room that can take up kind of your whole right-hand panel, and that way it'll be easier to follow. Same for on that right-hand panel, you'll also see media viewer. and you can make that small as well. So you see that chat in your full right-hand panel, okay? So I'm just going to kind of go over these, and if you guys have any just feedback or thoughts or questions, this is pretty open, both on this concept in general. What I want to know, just to be more pointed about it, what I want to know is what would be helpful to you? What would you be interested in? You can say, do anything, Rachel, but please don't have another listserv. Or you can say, listservs are my best friend, I love them. Or you can say, you know, I don't know, but I do know that I'd love to incorporate TILA slides into trainings at my local agency. So any sort of thoughts like that, or just other questions. If you have questions about things, those are most welcome as well. And so some of the things that so I'll just go over some of the questions here. What would you want out of a TILA network? Or what would you not want? For example, ways to connect and share skills and resources. Would that be helpful to you? Would it be exciting just to be able to, for example, have quarterly calls where you can talk more with other lawyers or other legal advocates who themselves are building their trauma-informed legal advocacy skills? Whether they're incorporating it into training or not, they're just working on their own skills. Would you be interested in working with others on new TILA scenarios? And then the last question there, are you interested in being able to incorporate TILA materials into trainings for staff or volunteers at your agency? So all three of those are on the table, as well as any additional questions. I'll just pop up. This is one of my favorite. I use this slide for all kinds of stuff. I love this tree here. I'm going to read some of your guys' comments in a second, but I'll tell you first that this is a tree in Vieques, which is off. It's this little tiny island off the not in the mainland, but off of Puerto Rico. And this tree is 300 years old. It's huge. You really can't. I wish I had somebody stand in this picture when I took it, because the tree is huge. And the reason it curves like that is, you can't see it in the picture, but you see this beautiful curve. This tree has been growing and living and surviving and thriving for 300 years. And the reason it has that curve to its trunk is because the ocean is right on the left side off screen in this particular photo, and that's why the tree has that beautiful curve like that. So this is my last slide, just to give you some opening to put any questions or feedback that you have, and I'll read here what we have. Some things already. So if one person is saying it would be nice to connect with other California attorneys, so that's helpful because it has that piece, or it might be helpful particularly to talk to other lawyers, other attorneys in your state. Some things may definitely be state specific, so that's really helpful. From another person, I see this comment, would love to see a train the trainer. So more workshops can be given to folks interested. That's really helpful. Yeah, we did sort of like a little tiny taste of what a train-a-trainer might be today, but one thought was certainly to do a fuller training of trainers on the TILA, which would probably be online just because of resources, but we could certainly do something like that. So that's helpful. If other folks have thoughts on a train-the-trainer style webinars on TILA, that would be really helpful. Another comment here, I think it would prove helpful to share resources within our local area, so that's really helpful. Another thought about having some way to connect, particularly with regard to sharing resources locally. That's really helpful, and that just reminds me of another, one way to do this may be to have a website where some of these materials are available, such as I would make some of the PowerPoints available so they could be pulled off and integrated into folks' local trainings. But people could also post resources that they made perhaps based off of TILA on the website, but we could do it as a private website, private web page. So that's one idea I've been playing around with, just if folks have things to comment about that. I have another comment here. Training the trainer, also another comment about how that might be helpful. That's really great. Another comment, I would also like some sort of email list or other form of contact. It'd be great to have a way to share strategies and brainstorm ideas. That's great. And then another comment, we would like to connect with other family justice centers. Okay, so that's really helpful. So this is a similar idea where it's be helpful to it sounds like some folks are saying it'd be helpful to connect with other attorneys or legal advocates who are either in a similar area, local area, or having maybe similar kinds of things come up because you work in family justice centers, for example, you're all working in family justice centers, or something like that. Okay, so those are really helpful. What I would love is if you've never done a TILA before and you want to go on our website at some point, watch the TILA intro, learn a little bit more about this. In any event, if you're listening to this and you're just starting to think, I don't know how I would interact with a TILA network, think about it and send me an email and let me know what kinds of things you're interested in. So I'm really trying to figure out what would work best for the field and launch some ideas in the fall. Really start to launch some ideas in the fall. So whether that's a listserv, some sort of way to maybe connect, have people be able to connect with other lawyers that are doing trauma-informed work, being able to connect with us around training of trainers. Maybe I could run a webinar series of a couple of train the trainers. That could be something we would do. If you have other thoughts about it, or if you have questions, sort of at any, if you're joining this TILA stuff at any stage of the game, but you're interested in working with us in some fashion, send me an email, get in touch. I'm really interested in making the connection with folks in the field. It looks like Erin just posted the link to the TILA page on our website, so y'all can check that out. And I really do want to hear from you as we sort of think through this together. And I feel really hopeful that we'll be able to create something that's helpful and manageable. And I'm interested in putting in the time to make it a good, easily accessible structure to help support your work. So I think that's it, and I don't know. I guess I'll turn it back over to Erin and Angelica. I appreciate you both very much for doing the logistics for today, and I'll let you all close up. And just a reminder to everybody to do the survey when you get off. Thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rachel. Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and I want to thank Rachel for such an exceptional webinar today. Thank you to Caption Colorado for providing today's captioning, and thank you to Angelica Medina for making the webinar run so smoothly. Last but not least, thank you all again for spending your time with us this afternoon. Within the next week, I will send a follow-up email with a link of the recording of today's webinar, in addition to slides and handouts, and probably some of the strategies that folks suggested, including Rachel's email. And you'll also receive a certificate of attendance for your time today. So like Rachel mentioned at the end of the webinar, there's going to be a really brief evaluation. So when you close the software out, it's going to take you to a page that's going to ask you some questions. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, basically on any scale, that would be really helpful. And thank you all so much, and we hope you have a great afternoon.